Next up is Simon Inger. If you saw an early version of the agenda, Simon was at the end of the day today, but he has to get to his prom tonight, his daughter's prom. So we move Simon up.
I don't think I'll be very welcome on a prom. Are we there? We're good.
All right, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. So when John originally asked me to talk, he asked me to come and address offsetting deals in Europe. It was one of the key things he wanted me to talk about. But then, of course, you can't really think about subscriptions and OA deals without looking at the background of both subscriptions and OA. And you can't understand Europe without thinking about how it slots into a world of subscriptions and open access attitudes. And you can't think about attitudes to open access without thinking about how the author's motives work across the world, the role of governments, and the sense of what's right for the world versus what's right for the individual. So we're going on a bit of a tour, and we're going to pull in some information from various projects I've been involved with over the last few years, anonymizing, simplifying data or whatever, knowledge from feedback from publishers and editorial matters, and just having the understanding of what the global market for sales is looking like. And we'll be pulling that from these various areas that we work in. So my history, everything on the left there, I've been at Blackwell's, I ran a journals platform many years ago, some of you will know. I've been in consulting for 17 years now, working with publishers, large and small, intermediaries, platform providers, national libraries, quite a wide variety, a lot of society work. Currently operating under the 4 brands on the left, on the right-hand side there. A lot of what I'm going to say today is drawn from knowledge we've gained through Renew Consulting for Societies. That is our brand that works with societies who have outsourced their journals publishing, in particular to the big commercial publishers typically. And we help them get better deals and teach them about what's going on in the space so that they understand what's going on. But we get a lot of information from that channel, of course. We do get to see what the very biggest publishers are doing with regard to all of these issues I've been talking about today. Renew Publishing Consultants is the brand that most of you would probably know me by. It's where we work with publishers, societies, not-for-profits, for-profits as well, on their publishing strategy, all aspects of that. On top of that, I'm a board member of AccuComms. AccuComms, of course, has a partner agreement with HighWire on the AggregAgent product, and I'll make some reference to that later on. And as of about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I became co-founder of a startup service provider in media technologies for societies and publishers called Cadmore Media, so you shall hear more about that in due course. So as Renew, this is roughly where our work comes from. About 21% UK, 52% North America, 19% the rest of Europe, and 8% for the rest of the world. So we do get a nice wide variety of clients, and again, I stress that geographical shift really because we do get to see very, very different stories from different parts of the world. So here's some very much approximate data, but broadly speaking, it's about, I think, what people get to see. So how much did each of these 3 regions pay for subscriptions? North America, I think, typically pays more for subscriptions than most other places. Europe pays quite high, but China tends to get its information very, very cheaply. And there's a lot of history to that. Andrew could tell you a lot about that as well. All those years at the American Chemical Society, probably lots of info on that. So it's interesting. Publishers bought, really, they gave their content away in China cheaply. Because apart from anything else, it buys you citations to your content. You get a massive audience. We know that China research is already, the amount of publication articles coming out of China is greater than that from the US now. And of course they cite content, so effectively by providing China with content cheaply, you end up in the situation where you buy citations cheaply. If the whole world transitioned to gold open access, how much would we end up paying then? I mean, this is just broadly speaking, they're roughly the same. North America would pay some less, Europe would pay less, and China would pay rather more than it does now if we made that transition. Within those areas, however, there are clear winners and losers. So in North America, the research-heavy institutions would be paying very much more, and the research-light institutions would be having a very nice free ride, which would work very well for a lot of people. If you look, though, perhaps within the UK, they're clearly winners and losers as well. I was in a meeting some years ago where Oxford University said they spent £6 million a year on their subscriptions. If everything went gold OA at $3,000 an article, it would cost them £22 million a year instead. They didn't fancy the 16 million difference, so had to look at other ways. But of course, within an environment where it's largely government controlled, governments can make those decisions at that level and even things out. So you can see that it's less of an issue, the difference between winners and losers in many European countries. But obviously on the face of it, a shift to OA for China does not look like a good idea. So how much do governments control institutions and the direction of travel in terms of a shift to open access? Well, obviously there's not that much control in North America. There's no real central push. Europe, of course, there is much more control, and China a very, very high degree of control. So logically you would say at this point, Europe will push for open access, won't it? It'll save money, and governments are organised enough to push in that direction. America isn't really organised enough to push for open access in a concerted way. It doesn't speak with a single voice, and there are obviously individual winners and losers, as we've said. But what's the story in China then? There's a lot of government control, so on the face of it, you'd think they'd want to stay where they are, but do they? Let's look at some other factors. So this is Simon's anecdata, definitely, but it's gathered from a lot of experience of talking to academics on editorial boards of journals from lots and lots of societies we've done work with. How much does the impact factor matter to authors? So and also by where they are in their career stage. In North America, early career people tend to really go for impact factor, titles with good impact factor, and in prime career, yeah, fair enough. But I've come across many, many senior academics, especially in America, who simply say, doesn't matter where I publish my stuff. Everybody's going to find me, I'm famous, thanks very much. I can publish anywhere, they will find me. So they're not driven in the same way. In Europe, however, because obviously to an extent tenure is linked to where you get published, funding is often linked to where you're published, and obviously how well your institution is funded is even linked to the outputs, the research outputs, then it matters very much, especially in prime career where you get published and the impact factor of where you get published. That also drops off in senior career for similar reasons, but there's still institutional pressure to go with the very best journals possible. And of course we all know that it really matters in China throughout the career as well, that people will push for impact factor. What about speed of publication? What does that matter? Well, we tend to find at the moment with a crunch on funding, especially in the States, that early careerists have to publish very, very quickly. And that's often because we hear a lot of labs in the States where they can't do more work until they've been the first piece they've got some evidence that their research is going well, they don't get the second tranche of funding until they've got the first piece published. So that puts a real speed of publication imperative, especially for early careerists in the States, that we find. We hear this a lot from societies. The imperative in China, however, is much less about speed. People are quite used to it taking a fair amount of time, but and obviously we'll go through other hoops to get published, especially language improvement services, which all take time. Now, interestingly, rightly or wrongly, open access is often perceived as a way of getting published faster. It's perceived that way, whether it's true or not. And of course, it's designed that way for very major silos like PLOS ONE and others. And of course, it's a nice way of speeding up publication in cascade situations that we were just being discussed there with Mecca. American scientists, as I say, often also need speed. So that's also kind of interesting, that balance. So authors are pulled in multiple directions. Some key funders want OA, but I've had a look at FundRef, and how many funders are on that list now? About 5,000 or something? It's an awful lot. Sorry? Very large numbers of funders. Very large numbers of funders, some of whom want open access. Some governments want open access, as discussed. Libraries are beginning to cancel big deals, and so lesser titles suffer in reach at that point. That's another interesting problem that authors have to pick up on. Some authors are driven by impact, some authors are driven by speed. And many senior academics are skeptical about open access. I've been, again, talked to editors-in-chief of journals, and they'll say, oh, well, this is a direct quote. This guy was telling me that if anybody applies for a job in my department, I look at their CV, look where they've been published, and I simply put a line through everything that says PLOS ONE. And then I start from there. So there's this perception about quality suffering in that particular brand, and that tends to go again. So people, often very senior people who are doing that recruitment have different perceptions of quality. And those, interestingly, those people also tend to sit on society boards and drive where those societies go. So where does that leave China? Really, obviously in a worse position if it pays for GOA in everyone's journals financially, but potentially better recognition for its authors, potentially. But I think what we're going to see is that China will start to, well, we are seeing publishers popping up in China to launch their own open access journals in particular, and that kind of has to be the next step. As long as the brands are strong enough to achieve everything that the Chinese researchers need. And there is increasing talk as well whether a Chinese organization will acquire a multinational publisher just to solve the problem, as it were, immediately by giving speed and brand recognition immediately, and obviously cutting the costs. So that could well sway things. So, here's Simon's completely made-up business model change factor, since the world needs a new factor. It's one of the things I do a lot when I'm working with societies, is look at their titles and decide, look at the gross subscriptions revenue for each title and divide it by the theoretical gold open access revenue. And if they publish more articles at a certain price, is that add up to more than the subscriptions? So in other words, if you get a fraction which is less than 1, it's rather encouraging for a society or anybody else to shift a title into open access. Now, there are a whole load of titles, high-impact titles, managed by large commercial publishers, which are on that very top line, where they sell way more subscriptions than they could possibly get in open access fees if they were to flip. And those titles are are very scared. The owners of those titles are quite scared about the future of OA. Those next tier down, medium impact titles in large commercial publisher, they probably still find it very tricky. And the low impact titles, less so, and it starts to look quite attractive. If you then translate to the middle block of three there, I've got high impact titles in a commercial publisher with reduced reach, and all of those scaled back. But the bottom three are, I think, the most interesting potentially. High impact titles in a mid-sized society publisher, medium impact titles, and a low impact title. It's not too scary when you look at a program overall for a lot of societies to look at that flip. And I think that's kind of interesting what it does for societies. So many societies fear open access, but often really because they've heard rather than calculated how well they'll do in that future. Taught to be scared of it. And almost all societies with a commercial publisher would receive reduced revenues in an open access future. So they're gently told this slight detail, generally leaving the academics in a bit of a quandary. But it isn't just down to price, that's the important thing. It's actually down to subscription value. High impact has more subscriptions as well. The irony of that is, of course, is that the worse you were at selling, the easier it is to go OA. And which is kind of interesting. Now, what's going on with the big deal? Well, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated comes to mind, and I know that's a misquote in itself, but anyway, there are still thousands of big deals. Depending on how you count libraries or deals or institutions, the big four publishers will tell you that their big deals reach anywhere between 3,000 and 9,000 libraries, which is obviously way more than almost anybody else's subscription journals will ever get to, where 500, 600 is a good result. But the demise of big deals are headline grabbing. Libraries do still want to buy inconvenient bundles, but also want to be able to select increasingly, which is the reason we invented Aggregagent at AccuComms, of course. Okay, so how do big publishers monetize big deals? Let's just think about that. So I've got 3 titles across the top. A high impact title where I'm saying it's impact factor greater than 7, just as an approximation. Medium between 3 and 7, lower anyway, less than 3. I know that's still good. Let's say the first title was priced somewhere between 4 and 10,000, a medium title between 1 and 4,000, and a low title between 400 and 1,000. Now there's 2 things going on here. So I've done a little heat map rather than putting hard percentages in. But if a big publisher went along to sell a big deal to a library and it said, okay, does that high impact title already exist in your collection? And if they said yes, then what's going to happen is they're going to keep that almost at list price, probably at list price in the ultimate collection. So the price realized by that high impact title is going to be very good in that new deal. For a medium impact title, the price realized is lower, and if it's and lower still. So that's that top heat map. If it's a new title, so they don't already subscribe, how much does the library pay for it as part of a big deal? The high impact title still attracts a very high proportion of its list price in the big deal. The medium impact title, much less, lower proportion, and the low impact title, almost no money at all. And then if you add in the likelihood that the library already had a subscription and therefore achieves the top line, well, let's say it's 50-50 for a very high impact title, a 20% chance for a medium and a 5% for a low. Multiply all that through and you see that the big deal returns 70% of the revenue to the very big titles, 30% to the medium titles, and about 1% to the tiny titles, which leads to a bit of a problem. because obviously if there's pressure on that big deal, the titles that the big publishers can't afford to support anymore are all of the long tail of titles. So you may not be aware, so I probably won't say who they were, but a major commercial publisher gave notice to 26 societies last year to quit publication of their titles because they couldn't make any money out of them anymore. So that's this same thing done as a cumulative price chart. The high impact titles, which are already more expensive in themselves, add most of the value of the big deal. The low impact titles, large numbers of them, add incrementally tiny amounts. And I've seen reports for societies who have a commercial publishing partner where they've been in a big deal and they really had to push hard to get the data, and they were given data by their publisher to say how much they were making out of each library, and it was like $2 from this library and $5 from this library. So sometimes $2,000 from another one, just depend how important or whether those titles were already subscribed in those libraries. So you're getting a lot of little bits on top of money. So there is a bit of a cull of smaller titles at the moment. Yeah, let's move on. So what about offsetting deals or read and publish deals? So some European governments through consortia are pushing for offsetting deals. So what happens is they get all the content in the big deal in the normal way, plus the right for scientists in the country usually to publish in their hybrid open access journals at a reduced rate. And that's interesting, it generally does only cover hybrid titles, not fully open access titles, which are seen as a completely different issue. And it's generally not free, it's generally, as I say, at a reduced rate. Now this of course tends to favour the bigger publishers who have access to these conversations again, because it's a very complicated thing to do to set these up. So there aren't many successful ones at the moment. We are, within Accucoms, putting my Accucoms hat on, we are just currently exploring how we can extend the aggregation model into that, and obviously with lots of publishers' permissions, is how we then can do an offsetting deal on behalf of multiple publishers in one go. So that's obviously tricky. The trickiest part of it is that most of these deals demand a single price for open access. Now that's going to be tricky to agree across multiple publishers. So that's a tough one. So we have one, of course, headline-grabbing one in the US, Royal Society of Chemistry and MIT, but interesting, isn't it? It's an institutional deal, not a national one. What other pressures are we seeing? Well, as many of you will be aware, we, as a consultancy, we run large-scale discovery surveys, and we've just completed one, and the results will be published, hopefully, when I finish writing it in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But here's a little bit of advanced information. One of the things we asked in the survey is what proportion of the journal articles that researchers read do they access from each of the following types of resources. And what we've done is plotted this for scientific technical engineering, and we've done it for high income in dark blue, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries down to grey. And as you can see on the far left, it varies between 30% in the lower income and 38% in the highest income of the time people say they're getting content from the publisher's website. The second block is Sci-Hub effect. People in high-income countries are saying 5% of the time they're getting their content from Sci-Hub. When you get to the lower middle income, we're talking 13% of the time. That's an awful lot of content. But then if you pan across to the second to the last one there, ResearchGate or Mendeley or other scientific social networking site, we're up around the 15% there as well. And of course, everything, free subject repository, institutional repository, or a copy emailed by the author or colleague, all of those uses are effectively free uses, notwithstanding open access content on the publisher site anyway. And of course that adds up to well over 50%, in fact over 60% even in the high income countries are being claimed as coming from not the publisher's website. So hot off the press there. That's a bit of a pressure obviously on the situation. What's interesting of course is that library discovery tends to lead people to library acquired products, whereas increasingly Google Scholar with its little right hand bar increasingly leads people to free incarnations, and we've definitely seen examples where people will click on the free incarnation because they can't be bothered to find out whether or not they're going to have to go through hoops of authentication to read the copy on the journal site. Definitely seeing a lot of that. So that simplification of the authentication process is going to be very important to change people's behavior. What about a fair price for hybrid open access? Obviously libraries are very worried about double dipping. You'd get charged for gold OA but don't reduce the price enough for the rest of the content. This is very cheeky, this is not advice as such. Titles above that break-even line of Simon's made-up business transition factor, whatever I called it, they probably need to double dip to survive. Yes, that's a bit provocative. It's a difficult situation. Obviously, the price that you might want to charge would be a proportion of the current year's content that's open access, or maybe a proportion of all content supplied as part of a deal. So it favors those who include a back file. Obviously, if I said as part of my pricing, if I had a $1,000 title and I said $800 of that is this year's content and $200 of that is access to the last 10 years, then I only have to discount from the 800, not the whole 1,000 for my offsetting my OA part. So that is difficult. Do you want to be fair or sustainable? I'd say not many libraries are looking closely at the pricing of titles from small to medium publishers, unless anybody puts in a high percentage change. There are studies and league tables, but I don't think most libraries have the time. But again, it's when you put your head above the parapet that you get noticed with these things. Where are we going? There's a lot of downward pressure on journal price and the journal product generally. So I think journals do become devalued slowly because we're in a market that has, especially the libraries, has a high inertia. And I do see different behaviors. North American libraries are increasingly different to libraries in the rest of the world, I think, in their habits, being more conservative about change, and protecting more the status quo, I think. I do think, I used to think that the long tail of publishing would be acquired, but I think now it's a bit more brutal. I think the long tail of publishing gets cut off. And I think basically many of the articles in that long tail of publishing will end up in the now land grab for content in open access. You see some publishers really going for volume and trying to aggressively grow all of their open access titles, because open access is a service business and you maintain your absolute margins through volume because you can't maintain your percentage margins that you have in an open access thing. So you can only grow volume. Years and years ago, Elsevier worked out, this is a Karen Hunter study that's going back a long way, worked out that so Elsevier publishes about 16% of all journal articles. They worked out if they wanted to make the same amount of profit, obviously not margin, but not percentage margin, but absolute margin, they would need to publish 47% of the world's articles. So clearly not very it's not really doable. But if you look at what Springer are doing, Springer are particularly aggressively attacking and trying to grab land. The other thing I think we're seeing is increased diversification, more in teaching products. So Sage is quite a good example of where it's going with Sage Knowledge and Sage Video, and launching tools for researchers and so on, diversifying its income streams. But also I'm seeing that amongst a lot of societies as well, as they diversify and do more for their members and monetize more CPD, CME, and monetizing the community in other ways, and getting more driving membership and so on. So I do think, I've got 4 seconds left, we are going open access in most subjects. I think offsetting will happen in Europe, but I think complete open access only happens if China says so. And that's me done.
Wow, there's a lot to think about in that. Questions for Simon?
I always like stunned silence.
I'll try a question. Integrating a lot of different stuff, and by the way, your Simon's model was pretty interesting. I've never seen that before. It suggests that scholarly society publishers might overall do better in OA than the large commercial publishers, unless they have very high impact journals.
I happen to think societies will do extremely well in OA generally, because OA is fundamentally a service business, as I said. The people you're servicing are the authors. The author becomes the main client rather than the library. The author is the client, which means that's the same community that the society reaches out to for its membership and conferences. So the societies own their communities and have to be in the best place to drive open access. So absolutely, I think the door is wide open for societies to actually do the land grab and be the dominant publishers in their subject niche, should they wish to be. Yeah.
So what I found interesting is some of the publishers that HighWire works with a few years ago started introducing OA journals. And this is when OA was younger, but their commercial partner would do it for them. And I found that perplexing because I wasn't sure why you needed a commercial partner to introduce an OA journal, but they felt they were small enough societies that they hadn't done new journal introductions repeatedly, like say, an ACS does or BMJ does. So it was, they were just not in running form to introduce new journals. I think more recently, almost everyone we work with has introduced at least one and sometimes more OA journals. So it might be that was not a persistent trend.
I think there's so many factors there. Usually, so I see a lot of these contracts, usually there's a non-compete clause.
There's
a non-compete clause. So the society is published by a commercial publisher, and that contract forbids them to run their own journal that might be in any way competitive to the main subscription journal. Of course, any journal in the same space is always going to be, so that's ruled out. I'm also dealing with another society right now that publishes with a major publisher, and the major publisher has come to them, literally. We are seeing these tactics at the moment and saying, we want to launch an open access journal in your subject space. We want to own it. We want you to co-brand it as a society with us. Mm-hmm. And in return, we'll give you $20,000 a year to use your branding. You've got a month to decide, and if you decide against it, we're going to do it anyway.
That might have been the formula that for those first couple I saw, because they perplexed me.
So I'm being asked to be involved in the negotiation, which is going to be fun.
I think the land grab is something that many of you who have introduced your own OA journals after seeing the success of Clause 1. Probably, I don't know if you called it a land grab, but that might have been part of what you were thinking, that my rejected articles are going out. I'd like to retain them. That was also one of the big motivations we saw with publishers who were picking up our Impact Visor service was the rejected article tracker. So I think there's something really interesting going on there. I'd be glad to talk with people about that. I'd like to talk more about your perceptions of what Simon's just told us, and maybe we can get together on some phone calls to talk more about that. Any questions or comments for Simon? All right, thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you.